WABE.
And I'm Sean Keenan, a reporter with Atlanta Civic Circle.
We both cover affordable housing. It's one of the biggest issues in the upcoming runoff election for mayor in Atlanta. And we put together this panel to understand how the next mayor who wins could shape how people live in the city.
Today we have Sarah Kirsch. She's the executive director of the Urban Land Institute Atlanta, a nonprofit education and research group that focuses on housing. Eugene Jones, he's the CEO of Atlanta Housing, a public agency tasked with providing housing to the city's low-income residents. And Deirdre Oakley. She is a professor of sociology at Georgia State University, whose research often focuses on housing. Thanks for being here.
Thank you.
And if anyone watching or listening has any questions, you can let us know online, and we'll try to get to them during the discussion. But to start us off, Sarah, I want to start with you. Could you outline the current reality now? What does housing look like in Atlanta as we head into this next mayoral administration?
I think it's helpful to think back to the last election, and housing had become, I think, to a lot of folks' surprise, the number one issue. There was a lot of anxiety about displacement. Housing affordability felt like a new problem in Atlanta. And in the 4 to 5 years since then, it has really just elevated to truly a crisis situation. I was digging through the data. Rents are up 15% year over year, 15% year over year. Home values, I think, are up 17, 18% year over year. And our friends at the Atlanta Regional Commission shared a really sobering statistic with me yesterday, which was that in the last 5 years, we have lost 165,000 homes that are priced below $1,000 a month. So that's roughly for someone earning $40,000, $45,000, $50,000 a year. You know, you want to be below that $1,000 a month. And as a 11 county region, we've lost 165,000 of those homes. So, you know, we've gone from this emerging issue and source of a lot of concern to something that's really a critical issue for all sorts of issues, from education to healthcare to income inequality to equity. You know, it sort of radiates into touching every issue that's critical to the city.
Sorry, say that again. What's the time span on that loss of affordable units?
5 years.
Yeah.
All right.
Really sobering, right? And you've lost them because prices have gone off. You've lost them from demolition of affordable units. It's not one single thing. But sort of a perfect, terrible storm of loss of that inventory.
So, inventory is one of our most crucial needs right now. Talk to us a little bit about you and Deirdre, the policies that Atlanta has in effect right now. How are they serving or not serving the low-income families who need the help the most?
You can go for it.
All right. So I think for the city of Atlanta specifically, I think that there are a lot of policies in place. There's a lot of work that's been teed up to get into the preservation game and get back into the production game. But we really haven't kind of gotten off go on a lot of those efforts. And I don't think it's for a lack of trying or a lack of good intention. You know, we've had this little pandemic the last 20 months. And I don't mean that lightly, but I mean, people have had other issues that they need to focus on. And so I think we are at this really critical crossroads of needing to shift from planning and good intentions to real implementation.
So Deirdre, maybe you could add to that. She said it's not from a lack of trying or lack of good intentions. So where are we falling short?
Number of units is one thing. I mean, probably one of the most important things when you're talking about inventory. So a lot of the policies will put aside X number of units at X below the average median income. But when you talk about average median income, a lot of those set asides, and there are only a few apartments, it's like a drop in the bucket, will be at 80 to 100%, where for people who are living in poverty, it really should be priced at 50%. And so then what happens is these families and individuals end up in completely inadequate housing. There's a lot of inadequate housing in slumlord housing in this area. So I think the people who are trying to make policy for affordable housing are really trying, but you're kind of going up against this huge, Atlanta is in the middle of all this development, and it's high-end housing to cater towards all the people moving into the city who are not the people who are living and at the poverty level or at worker force housing level. It's for people who are making a lot of money. So you just have, as you said, like the perfect storm of all of these different things happening.
Well, sitting next to you is Eugene, who is in the business of providing housing to some of the most vulnerable people in the city. You are mainly serving people who are, below this workforce housing that you're describing, which is often like 80% of the area median income, which can, I think, could be like around like $40,000 to $50,000 for, gosh, I mean, maybe you have the numbers off the top of your head. It's always changing every year.
That's for sure.
Yeah. But I'm curious, from your perspective, you're relatively new. You've been in Atlanta for a few years now, right?
Right.
What has struck you as the most immediate challenges as you try to do your job in the city?
I guess the number one thing is that it would be nice to have a master plan of the whole city and who's doing what in the city, and maybe have a strategy and try to prioritize where we need affordable housing. And I think everyone's doing a lot of great things, but we need to be doing one great thing for the city of Atlanta. And that means we're all at the table. We're all making our decisions, strategy, and so forth. And then someone makes a decision saying, this is where we're going to go. And we don't deviate from that unless there's something that, someone's coming in with $50 billion and, hey, we just got to change this. But other than that, we got to stick to our goals. We got to stick to what we know. We're very intelligent. We're all practitioners. We just need to sit down. We need to focus so that we can make this transparent and publicize it. Say, here, what are you going to do in Atlanta? Here's what we're going to be doing in the next 5 years. We're going to be looking at this neighborhood, that neighborhood, and this neighborhood, and making it all inclusive, that no one's getting more than anyone else, but they have to spread the wealth. And I'm not just saying put a couple of $1 million here, put 20 million. I'm talking about it should be spread evenly, but it should have a goal, and everyone should be accountable for that goal.
So that's interesting. You're asking for a master plan, because I remember at the Atlanta Regional Housing Forum, when they had the mayoral candidates, I heard a lot of them say, we don't need to do any more planning. Like, we've done enough plans and conversation. We just need to do. And I think maybe they're referencing House ATL, the group of civic leaders that Sarah was involved in, that came out with all these recommendations for housing in the city. So I'm wondering, like, what's missing? What do you think is missing, Eugene? And I'm curious,
It's not a plan.
Okay.
We all have the plan. We need to sit down and put the plan together and make it one, and not just 12 or 13 or 14. We need to have one plan that we all support. If Beltline's doing this, hey, we support this. If Invest Atlanta's doing this, hey, we support that. We've all agreed to it. We're looking at leveraging the resources, and we're showing not only the city but the state that we have a plan together, and we need resources to make this plan successful and positive. I don't want to recreate the wheel. I don't want to do another study. I don't want a whole bunch of other numbers. Well, if the sky was dark, it's going to be. We don't need all that. We already have the numbers. Policy. Now we need action. We need implementation, and that's what we're good at. And if they give us the opportunity to implement with the resources and trust our judgment, we can do a lot more in this city.
Sarah, what do you think about that?
I agree 100%. I mean, I think that the sentiment that you heard from the Housing Forum is spot on, and that we know what needs to be done. There are questions of priorities, but I think if we have a lesson of the last 4 years is that time is precious, right? A notion of doing an audit or anything like that, I frankly don't think we have the luxury of time of taking 9 months, 12 months because you don't know what's coming down the pike, right? You don't know that there's going to be a cybersecurity event at the city. You don't know that there's a major health crisis. And when you have these windows of opportunity to really move, you need to move quickly. And so I do think we do not need another audit. We don't need another plan. But I appreciate the, how we all work together. I think a bright spot is this notion of how we work together with funding, right? How we can braid public resources like the Housing Opportunity Bond, or if we get this dedicated funding source with philanthropic sources and private sources and our favorite, land to bring that all together. And I think we've got the strength of relationships and the strength of talent to do that. And I think that's where it really kind of the rubber hits the road is, you come up with a funding strategy that aligns to the place-based plans between Atlanta Housing and Beltline and MARTA and all the key kind of infrastructure partners to make it happen.
So for both of you, since this whole conversation is kind of framed around the fact that there is a new generation of leadership coming into Atlanta right now, and you said you wanted a solid master plan. I think our current mayor would assert that the One Atlanta Affordable Housing Action Plan is that master plan. Is it just a problem of implementation right now?
I think just going back to it. We have it there, but we haven't gone back to it to either change something, update, whatever the case may be. But there's different players who moved in and out. I'm new to the city. There's probably some other people who have been new to key positions. We need to go back to that plan that the mayor put together, and we need to sit there and look at it again. Do we need to change this portion, or is this portion adequate so that we can move forward? But we just all have to be on the same page. We all have to know where the funding is coming from. We all have to know who's building what. We all have to know if there's some gaps. How can we fulfill those gaps? Who's getting philanthropic dollars? Who should we be going to? And if we don't know, we can't help each other.
Yeah, I think it should be a more coordinated effort. There's so many different entities providing or trying to provide affordable housing. I mean, Atlanta Housing is one entity out of many in the city. And if the efforts were more sort of coordinated, especially in terms of where are you building it? And so if Atlanta Housing is building here, well, we don't need another organization to build there. We need them to build over here. So it's not going back and doing another plan. It's more about looking at this plan and, as Eugene said, looking at gaps, but also looking how are all these entities with all this expertise going to coordinate the effort? Because that's how it's going to get done faster.
So whose role is it to lead that coordination effort? Is that a public official's job? Is that the mayor?
I don't know. They can hire me.
I think it's just we need to get together and we need to propose something to those officials. And I think if we put a plan together and we get them to buy off on it, I think that's going to way we're going to be doing. We know what we're talking about. We know what we'll be doing. And I think if we show that and put it down on paper, whatever that format will be, I think we'll be more successful because, once you have 10 or 12 or 13 entities that say, hey, look, this is a good plan. We're going to live and die by this. I think we got to push it so that they can push it further.
I do think there's value in having named leadership like the chief housing officer, a cabinet level position.
We don't have one right now, right?
We do not have one right now, correct? And I think you heard every candidate running say they committed to something that was akin to that. And I think that's important, not just because there are at least five public entities that are responsible for housing. There may be more than
more.
that.
There are more.
But it's also how do you interface with partners in the nonprofit space, with Atlanta Public Schools, right, who recognizes the importance of stable housing to their goals and teacher housing. And, you need the person that you call, right? And that doesn't mean that they need to have, command and control, but they need to be able to, coordinate and help with communication and help with alignment and those types of activities. And I do think that's important.
Does that mean creating a whole office around housing? Because I always found the chief housing officer position a little bit confusing because it was outside of the Office of Planning and Development, and I think that in itself must have created some coordination issues within the city. I mean, without really knowing what was going on the inside. But how would you envision that new role in the next administration maybe working?
I think there was a commitment, I think, from a lot of candidates that it was someone who would report directly to the mayor, which I think is key if it's not the mayor's responsibility. I mean, I defer to those who are inside of how it works best. Not my job to tell people how to structure it, but I do think it's critical that it's the right hand in a way of the mayor on that regard.
I mean, Eugene, do you think they should oversee the Office of Planning? I know we're getting in a little bit into the weeds, but I am just very curious because that is housing.
I guess
isn't
my
it?
experience is that no, they're better separate than being together, because planning has their goals and objectives and housing has their goals and objectives. You do need someone that's going to be strong in the administration to talk about housing and push that effort based on what the mayor has asked for, the city council. And so you need that liaison, that they understand the ramifications if funding, grants, cities look at home dollars, they look at CDBG. How does that all factor into these neighborhoods in which we're trying to invest in? And it goes back to what Sarah was saying. We just need to sit down, and we have, but we just need to have that person in the mayor's office that we sit down, we all coordinate what we're going to coordinate, and bring that back to the city officials and say, hey, look, we need you to buy into it. And hopefully you can tweak it, whatever you want to do, but we need a plan that we can show the public, here's what we're standing behind. And hopefully when we go to city council, you have things that you have to pass in resolution, it'll be a lot smoother, and everyone would know the knowledge of what's going on in the city when it comes to housing.
Keeping the housing office separate from planning and development, doesn't that set up the potential for people tripping over each other or having conflicting goals?
No, they're meeting. They're constantly meeting. They're constantly sitting at the table. They're deciding, making issues, and the mayor is driving what they do on the planning side and on the housing side. Yeah. And so they have to come together. You have a strong mayor, they're going to say, hey, what do you do in this neighborhood? Or what are the resources are at? But they're going to be stronger separate than they are together, because who's going to make a decision? Who thinks that they're going to make a better decision than internally? You have housing, you have planning. They just theoretically are addressing the issues that we love and we're close to our hearts.
I think we've talked about funding and resources, so I think that'd be a good next area to go into. Deirdre, how do you think the next mayor could leverage the resources that Atlanta already has?
Well, a strong mayor could definitely do that easily. But there's something else. There's a sort of devil in the details here, because one thing about Atlanta is that commercial property taxes are way underassessed. And so if they were assessed at I think they're assessed at maybe 50% of their value. So if they were assessed higher, that would mean more funding towards housing. Part of it would go to public schools. But that's a really sticking point issue. That would be an amazing resource. It's just considered not business friendly.
Or, a lot of homeowners don't want to see their property taxes rise either.
But I don't think this is for commercial
properties. Okay.
It's not homeowner property. Okay. And it's basically, it's built like that to attract businesses. But this city doesn't. This city is attracting businesses right and left, and lots of people are in-migrating and everything. So, aside from the other resources that are out there, this could be a huge resource in terms of being able to build more affordable housing.
Tapping into that funding?
Yeah.
What have been the hurdles historically? Why aren't we doing this already?
Because we live in a capitalist world, and cities around the country want businesses to be in their city, so they get tax incentives, all of that kind of stuff to move in. And what it means is probably, I can't talk for the candidates themselves, it means that, would that be considered anti-business? And you need the tax dollars. But what's weird about it is that it's so underassessed, they could be getting a lot more tax dollars to address this housing crisis. So I don't know if it would ever happen. We also have a lot of regressive regulations. So I've got 2 housing experts here who probably know them all. And so building affordable housing, even if you have the money, you've got to go jump through a lot of hoops.
Amen.
I mean, it's interesting that we're talking about, I guess, this balance beam or seesaw of prioritizing businesses versus people. And I don't want to get too philosophical here, but do you think at the like city leadership level or even above that, there is this this trend of thinking of businesses before you think of the most marginalized people in a community?
I do, but I also think we're at a critical point right now because businesses are having a hard time hiring people. And that drives wages up. But if we don't have enough housing to house people who are making, they're still not going to be making high wages. You're talking about, let's say, instead of minimum wage, you're making $15 an hour. But that still puts you in an income level where you can only afford so much. So, it's one of those balancing acts that have to be done. But I really think that the mayor of the city has to come out with a really strong policy that involves all of these experts that want to produce or are producing affordable housing.
Connecting, making sure people have affordable housing near jobs is such a huge part of this conversation, and I really want to get to it a little bit later. In terms of resources, one thing that has come up a lot is land. And Eugene, I know you're asked about Atlanta Housing's land a lot, the land left over from the projects that were demolished, a decade ago. How do you see that, what's left, playing into the next mayor's affordable housing plans?
So let me talk about the philosophy of vacant land.
Okay.
It just seems like there's this misunderstanding about vacant land. Yeah, there's a lot of vacant land. First of all, is it buildable? That's the first question. Is it environmental? Has it been eradicating any environmental issues and so forth? And then you got to think of the neighborhood. A lot of still NIMBYism out there in the neighborhood. And you just can't plop a home on some vacant land or some units on a vacant land and then call it a day. It is very expensive when it starts in our neck of the woods. As Deetra was, I know I said her name wrong.
It's okay.
As she was saying, I have to hire an architect. I got to go through a procurement process. I got to evaluate that. I got to put an RFP together. I got to make sure that everything's done. I got to go to the board, say, will you allow me to do this RFP? Go get the RFP. We get the responses come back in. We got to evaluate that. Then we have to select something. Then we got to go back to the board for them to approve it. And then ultimately we got to go to HUD and they have to sit there and say, we'll approve it. And people think that it takes a year. It takes about 5 years to build something like 200 to 300 units because of all the regulation, the red tape. And we got to get the public involved. We got to get the city involved. We have to get every type of institution involved in it. And then we got to finance. What happens is that they figure you're supposed to, when you hire a developer, they should be figuring out the financing. But they don't put any equity in the deal. They're looking at HUD, they're looking at Atlanta Housing and say, hey, look, you want to do this, then this is what you're going to have to do to pay for it. And when people sit there and say, well, how come you can't build more affordable housing units? We're building a minuscule of the number of affordable housing units that we need in this city, just like across the country. We got 40 here, we got 10 here, we got 13 here. Inclusionary, I'm looking at the paper today, they have a 400 unit building somewhere and they're only building 14 affordable units. Now, how's that going to get to the end game? And we always look at the minimum instead of looking at the maximum. And developers are looking at paying off the debt. So that's why they want market rate, they want some tax credits, and they want some type of housing to make the numbers work. And it's always the affordable housing that's always losing out because they can't make the numbers right. And people, the general public needs to understand that. We want to build. If we have enough resources, if I have $1 billion, I tell you what, I'll turn over about 5,000 units tomorrow if I can get $1 billion and cut the red tape. Let me do this, get the architects, get in, cookie cutter everything. We already have those plans in place. Let's do it. But we're so back down when it comes to red tape and regulation. We got to cross this T, dot this I. We got to send it here. We got to come back. They don't like it. We got to change the plan. The city planning department doesn't like what we're doing. We need this doorknob on this side and not on that side. So it's all in the details. And so when people understand, when you get money 5 years ago, it's not the same amount of money 5 years in the future. So if it costs you $200 to buy 5 years ago, it's going to cost you about $600 or $700. So now you got to change the numbers all over again. And everyone looks at it and says, why can't you build? Well, I'm just letting you know, this is why we can't build. And it's nothing that we can do per se. It's just the economy, labor, construction costs. It just escalates. It never goes down, ever, that I've seen that it ever goes down. And that's what we do. And that's what we look at. We ask our partners for suggestions and wherewithal, but it's tough. It's not just vacant land. It's just the wherewithal having resources. If we don't get our city leaders to go to Congress and write a national housing policy across this country so they can tie in resources, because we're the only industry that I know that we're not in the top 20 conversation when it comes to issues that are happening in our country. We're always down at the 20th. But it's so important, we should be at the top 5. Instead of, transportation, education, and so forth, they're all important. There's nowhere housing. We're always the last to get anything. We got to beg for our money. We got capital improvements that we need to happen, and we talk to Congress. Well, you look at the $1.2 trillion of infrastructure. They cut down housing again. We still can't get there, but they still demand that we get, affordable housing and quality housing. We're still going to try to do that.
Can I just say one thing about this? Well, actually, 3 things. Okay. Short, don't worry. Where Bankhead Court was, the project, I prefer to call them traditional housing communities. That was built on top of a landfill back when it was built so many years ago. So when Bankhead was demolished, that is an example of a large swath of land that housing cannot be developed on. It can't. It wouldn't pass any kind of environmental regulation. So now I think it's the bus terminal or whatever for Atlantic Public Schools. So that gets to Eugene's point. The regulations at HUD, I know, are outrageous. And the other thing is, when you talk about HUD, it is actually easier to demolish housing than it is to build housing.
Well, so you described that regulatory process very well, and I'm curious, about the next mayor, how they could help speed that up. Is it just they have to be a better advocate to the to Congress and the federal government? Is that all? Is there anything else they could do to help you with that?
First of all, they had to be educated on our demise. That really takes time. You got to be a good listener. You have to understand from all phases of what we do. This is really what we're doing. And it's not that we don't want to provide, is that we're stricken by things that we just haven't changed, like an ordinance. The housing choice voucher, the Section 8 program, landlords don't have to take Section 8. So when we give out a voucher, we're hoping and wishing that this potential resident can find housing. If you're denied, they have at least 6 months to find a place, and they come back and say, I got to turn my voucher in. I can't find a place. That is sad. And so when people say that they want affordable housing, we have the mechanism to do it, but the landlords are not trying to support us. And so we're stuck in the middle. We're trying to do everything, bring landlords in, trying to make them understand the program. We're trying to despise all the negative things, where they're going to bring crime. Junebug is going to come in here and do these vicious things. They're going to, it doesn't happen. Yeah, it happens in small smidgets, but it doesn't happen in overall. We build neighborhoods, we build communities. With the staff that we have, we look at changing neighborhoods and trying to make it seamless. We're not saying plucking some housing and say, okay, when you drive by, oh, that's public housing over there. Oh, that's Section 8 housing. No, when we build housing, you can't tell. The housing that we're building today rivals anything on the private sector. If you look at our senior buildings, you can go in any private sector, and I bet you we'll win hands down about what the facilities that we do and our mixed income. We're proud of that. But we got to take the egos out of our colleagues and say, hey, look, we don't care. You can get the ribbon cut, you get the mayor there. I don't care. My bottom line is I got to build housing. I got to build it quick. I got to build it affordable. And I have to convince my board and HUD this is the right pathway to take. And that's a long, hard task, and you got to be experienced about that. But you got to look at regulations. You got to understand regulations from top to bottom in order to support our staff who put these things together to support it. If you sit there and you procrastinate, say, well, give me a couple of months, let me think about it. It's too late. As Sarah was talking about, it's too late. We don't have that much time.
So this is a question for all of you, but it's kind of inspired by you saying that city officials have to be educated on our demise. And you helped me with a story a few weeks ago where it kind of highlighted that a lot of the people who are running for mayor back when there were 1,000 of them didn't have a firm grasp on what Atlanta Housing does. And Atlanta Housing also recently took Terry Lee as its chief operating officer, leaving the city of Atlanta without a chief housing officer. So I want to hear from all of you about what you see from officials as, like, do you see a sense of urgency in addressing these issues? Or do you see like a baseline of education that they have? Or is everybody just kind of lost?
I'll start on a positive note that
Yes.
I thought, I think the level of discourse and the commitment to progress is light years ahead of where it was 4 years ago. And our current mayor is who made the big, bold promise and came up with One Atlanta action plan. And, so all of that is well and good. But I think the sense of urgency, the notion that, Atlanta has a window of time to stay Atlanta before it's just not, I do think that resonates. I mean, it will be determined, right, how this next mayor implements. And, my greatest hope is that they have no pride in authorship, that they have pride in implementation, right? That it is going to be about,
Good point.
The construction, the preservation. And I don't think that it's a question of the mayor specifically needing to know exactly what regulatory barrier needs to be removed or exactly what piece of funding needs to be lined up. I think it needs to be a commitment to when one of the senior leaders comes and says, here is the obstacle we need removed, that there's a commitment to say, I'm going to do everything I can to remove that obstacle, right? And I think that is the real opportunity before the next mayor is to say, it's building relationships outside of maybe core operations of the city. City doesn't do tax assessments, right? You got to have a relationship with Fulton County tax assessor. A lot of the funding, it's coming through HUD. It's coming through maybe relationships with the infrastructure bill, right?
That's correct.
It's about working outside of the silos and building those relationships with other partners in the region to move it forward when you get that specific ask.
Okay. I think that one thing to remember is that a mayor has staff, and they can have staff that are educated and experts in all these regulatory hoops that you have to jump through. I'm sure Eugene has plenty of people on staff who know that stuff. And you can't go out to the general public and say, well, this regulation and that regulation,
right.
You're going to make them fall asleep. It's more kind of putting a plan out there, and they have to have some knowledge that it takes a long time for development. It takes much longer for affordable housing that's being funded with federal funds and state funds and local funds, government funds, to get built than these private developers that put things up. It seems like almost overnight, all of a sudden your neighborhood is, what's that apartment building doing there? So that's one thing that the public and the mayor and all the people, the constituencies need to understand. People who are outside of actually doing this kind of work. Eugene understands, Sarah understands, I understand a little bit. But other people have to understand that the timelines are very, very different because of all of these regulations. Bet you if you did a study of all the regulations that, let's just concentrate on HUD, that they have, I mean, it would probably be a 3-volume book or something. And HUD is always in last place, like Eugene said, that it's the federal agency that gets the least attention. So
you know what we should do? Do a TV program, questions and answers, once a week, and talk about whatever questions that they have, and really tell them and be really blunt about it. Say, okay, Gene, how come what's taking you so long of building Herndon, the second phase? I can sit there and just tell them, educating, so they really understand the process that we have to go through. And then maybe they'll understand, they'll learn, then they can go to the congressional staff, to the city staff, whatever the staff, but at least they're educated and they understand our plight. That's all I want. I want the story to get out, the right story of all our colleagues. We speak the same thing, but we're just not there. We just need to get our vantage point, what we're trying to do as an agency, as a city, and put it out there. But people are just not asking the right question. Or they say, "Hey, look, just go ahead and do it." Like she said, a private developer, 18 months they'll have a building up, boom, and there's no public comment. There's very little. I put up a building, I got to go through the community. I got to go through the residents. I have an enormous amount of time that I have to spend just to get there. And then, Lord and believe, we break ground, and there's something that may happen. Well, we didn't find this before, but there's an environmental issue. There's an elevator shaft down there. We didn't know about it. Okay, now Gene, how are you gonna pay for it? So now we gotta stop. We gotta sit there and reconfigure the numbers and so forth. That's what we don't get to share. And not to say we should, but they should understand what our process goes to my staff intimately going into these developments and trying to make these things work. It's tough. It's tough with the regulations. It is very tough. But I commend the staff because they're there, and I commend the community in which we work in because we do talk. If anyone wants to get with the community and understand or talk to a community, it's every housing agency across this country. We know how to talk to the community. We know how to break it down. We know how to make it transparent. We know how to make them understand. Now, they may not agree, but at the end of the day, someone has to make a decision. At least you put it out there and you make them understand, here's what we're going through, and here's the end game. And if they still don't understand it, take them by the hand and go show them a development that they didn't think will ever be built. Go show them and say, here it is. This is what it takes. Talk to the residents. We're doing what we said we're going to do. But here's an example of what we do.
I was going to say, it's not always so easy, though, to get, as you know, I'm sure, neighborhoods on board with affordable housing. I know that, and even in Southwest Atlanta, where folks are really aware that prices are going up, and I think they would like to see more affordability preserved. There's also a feeling that all of the affordable units get put in their neighborhoods and it's not spread out, across the city. And of course, right now we have this debate over zoning changes that would allow more density in certain neighborhoods. And there's been a lot of opposition to that around the city, but especially on the north side. So that seems like a real challenge that the next mayor will have to deal with. Like, how do you sell more affordable units or throughout the city in good neighborhoods with amenities that people want? Deirdre, I know that's something that's, you've really found that a lot of people, a lot of low-income families in Atlanta end up concentrated in certain areas. Have you thought about the solution to that?
Well, yeah, I mean, we're always going to have NIMBY. I mean, it's this fallacy that if people of a certain income level, and we can also talk about race, move into an area, property values would up. There's no empirical evidence that shows that. But the perception and the stereotype is there, just like Reagan's welfare queen is still in our lexicon.
Yeah.
That it's a really, really hard sell. What can you do about it? Yeah, you can go out and you can educate people. But the other thing you can do is you don't have to call it affordable housing. You can come up with another creative term. I mean, come up with a creative term or something, but also if you look at the housing that Atlanta Housing has now, the new housing that they built, and you can see the same thing in the city of Decatur, it does not look like traditional public housing. You would not know it's public housing or affordable housing. So, I mean, if people could even get educated on that, like, look at this beautiful housing, you know. Yes, I have people living here who are at 50% of the average median income. That might be one way around it. But it also, when it gets so bad that people are leaving the city because they can't afford to live in it, so they're moving out to the suburbs, and then they're getting jobs out in the suburbs. So then the city has a shortage of labor. That's what's going to get people really thinking about it. Probably the first groups of people that would be helped would be the civil servants, which are not at the absolute low end, but they don't have enough money to live in the city.
Working poor.
Sarah, I imagine you have a
Working poor,
really
yeah.
interesting perspective on this, on the zoning review board especially.
Yeah, I mean, I think the reality is that there is resistance to change in every corner of the city. And I think that has something to do with the pace of change that we've experienced the last 10 years in particular, right? We went from a city that had never had much growth to having 10, 20% of the growth of the region in terms of building permits, in terms of jobs. And, you know, so I think there's some psychology here of just how much change can anyone take. And, you know, I think if you're in a neighborhood that has seen a lot of investor activity, or you feel like development's being done to you and not with you, anytime a new ordinance is coming down or a major project, the human reaction is to sort of dig your heels in and say, whoa, 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 right? So I think that is just sort of where we are from a culture perspective. And I think some real honest feedback and concern of what is this going to do for me, right? We have a city of enormous wealth, and that wealth is not flowing the way it should to the folks who've been here a long time, right? And so why should I accept this if there's not going to be any real benefit? You know, I think there's some real tactical things you can do. At ULI, we have a program called Urban Plan, where we take resident leaders through an RFP process, and they have to play different roles. And at the end of it, you know, it's my favorite. We did it with NPUV. We did it with all sorts of NPU leaders. And at the end, you know, a guy will say something like, my only problem with this program is it came 20 years too late. Because if I'd had this information before I sat down to negotiate community benefits with developer XYZ, I would have asked a whole different suite of questions. So I think there's also this element of, you know, taking a page out of their playbook of how do you do development in a way that people can have a good seat at the table. You're going to have pushback to affordable housing everywhere, just to be honest. There, you know, we do see at Zoning Review Board now some communities coming forward and saying we'll only approve this if there is an affordable set aside, which is new. You didn't have that 3-4 years ago. So that's a change of discourse. I think that's another bright spot. But I think it's about making it how it solves their problems, right? How does having people who work in your community be able to live in your community? It helps with traffic. I know that sounds super transactional and not like a moral basis for it, but you know, guess what? Schools don't have to shut down when we get an inch of snow if teachers can live in the city that they serve. Same thing with police and fire, right? You just have to talk about it in a way that people go, okay, I see how this makes my life better. How my mother, when she retires, has a place to live. How my kid, when he comes back from college, has a place to live. Like, I think it's just personal stuff.
So it sounds like we're talking a lot about finding ways to navigate these misconceptions about what stuff like, I mean, you said earlier, public housing. I mean, it's kind of been this demonized term used to say what traditional housing communities, when people hear density, they think that their single family home is threatened with like skyscraper development. Is it just a matter of bringing people up to speed in really bare bones ways so that they understand that, specifically with zoning, it's not a threat to their way of life to allow for an accessory dwelling unit or, you know, a small apartment complex down the block from, you know, what would otherwise be a suburban style neighborhood?
Well, I mean, these misconceptions have gone on for a very, very long time. And so actually changing them, that's challenging. But the other thing is that we now have probably more than a decade of history of gentrification, where the existing residents that live in these communities, if they're not getting physically pushed out, but that's a potential, they might be getting culturally pushed out, they might be getting politically pushed out or socially pushed out. And so they don't get a seat at the table when other development is coming in. And typically, if it was mixed income housing, they probably would be more amenable to that. But for instance, what's going on in Peoplestown? The residents, the long-term residents, are really getting screwed over. And I'll say my university is part of it.
What role does the next mayor have in the Peoplestown issue right now?
That's a good question. I don't know if my colleagues here know it. All the development that's going on now there is partnerships between GSU and private developers. So I'm not sure what the mayor's role would be
So
there.
you're talking about Peoplestown and Summerhill more broadly.
Yeah.
Are there, we've talked a lot about what Atlanta could do and what's going wrong. Are there other cities that could serve as a good model for a lot of the things we're talking about? Eugene, you've worked in several. You're shaking your head.
They're all over the United States, but
Yeah.
we have to be more innovative. We just can't do the plain old cookie cutter and so forth. We got to look at libraries. How can we build units on top of a library? How can we look at a Target that's moving in the community and build units on top of Target? So there's workforce housing right there. Or we have opportunities for the seniors to not go 10 miles to a grocery store, but they have one right there. We got to change the dynamics. Density works, but you guys have a problem here with traffic.
Oh,
and
yeah.
you keep building density. Why doesn't anyone think about closing a streetscape and make it walkable so there's no cars that come down there unless it's a fire or something like that? We just need to change the dynamics and be innovative and try something. If you let us try and see if we can work, I think we'd be better off because, wow, we've done this.
Well,
we could do this differently.
I think Tim Keene would love something like that, but we're talking a lot about the next generation of leadership. The city council is kind of a roadblock there towards some of these innovative ideas.
I think you got to sit there and
Constituents who want to drive their cars through the city.
You got to take them
Yeah.
to a place where it does work. You got to show them how it works. Now, it's not going to be perfect, but you just give them a little spark in their mind and say, hey, look, this could work. Let's get the people together when we get back home and say, let's see if we can make this work. That's all you got to do. I mean, if you just got to change your apparatus and your process of trying to provide a more affordable housing. You get a library, you're getting a twofer here. You're getting a library that's going to provide all the ramifications of residents that live in that community, older, elderly people going to a library, sitting down, they can have coffee classes. That's how you build your community. That's how you build your neighborhood. You have a destination point, and you have units on top of a place like that. So you got both. You got economy of scales. So it won't cost you $20 million, it may cost you $15 million. And the rest of that money, you can sit there and provide services that are needed in the surrounding community. You just don't plop affordable housing and not take care of the surrounding community because they're going to feel like they're disjointed. So you got to, okay, what can we do together? Just because I have a mixed income development here does not mean you can't take advantage of some of the amenities that we have here. If we have a pool or we have a Y that's close by or that we built for the residents, can the whole community participate in that? You got to be inclusive. You got to be seamless in the community and make the community, have the community buy off onto what you're trying to do. And it just works better because the whole community is working. And when you have the police, you have APS, you have everyone connected, then everyone's looking out after each other. And we build strong communities that way, better neighborhoods, better schools, and crime has been reduced.
And green space.
Right, green space.
That's a
Lots
great
of green
vision.
space.
Are there any cities, though, that are like comparable to Atlanta? It would just be nice, Sarah, is there one that you often point to like, that we can like we can see it in action?
I think the reality is that you have to sort of cherry pick policies, cherry pick examples. I mean, we do have some of the national examples in Eastlake, in Centennial. I mean, these are held up as national examples. People say, well, Sarah, Atlanta's doing all the right stuff. And you go, we do have pieces of the right stuff, just not at scale, and a lot that we've sort of not been doing for a while. But I think this point of doing things in very place-based ways, in coordinated ways, across green space, across transit infrastructure, with schools, that's how you deal with a lot of the NIMBYism, right? Because it's in a manageable way of thinking about how the community's growing. It's how you make sure that, everything with housing is a housing and, right? It's housing and transportation. It's housing and educational outcomes, housing and healthcare. We hear housing is healthcare all the time these days, right? And so that requires partnership. It requires working across, different sectors and disciplines. And I think the only reasonable way you can do that is in place-based ways, in a neighborhood with specific properties. So there are examples all across the country. I don't know that there's one that you sort of lift up and say that's who's doing really great place-based work, but Atlanta has more developable land than a lot of cities. And so the opportunity here is pretty significant.
That's correct.
You can find places that have done one really good thing, cities, but maybe they have a problem with something else. So I don't think you can say this city is doing everything right, because I don't think any one city is.
But a lot of places don't have the same state laws, right? I think that comes up a lot in Atlanta. Is there any, for example, the state ban on rent control is a big issue that comes up a lot. And the state, from what I understand, actually doesn't really allow source of income discrimination laws that would allow, would prevent landlords from not accepting Section 8 vouchers. How can the next mayor get around, even just the state, getting past those state barriers?
I think the source of income protection is a really important one. So we can use the tools that we have. It's a question of who the governor will be and what the response will be. I think Austin passed a source of income protection, and then it got overruled by the state of Texas. And so that always feels like an interesting analog. And so you need to figure out those politics before you waste a lot of time and political capital on that particular one. Obviously our rate of evictions and you're an expert on that, of how quickly those move in Georgia compared to almost anywhere, and what that does to broad housing instability and all of the related issues, is one that I'd want to focus attention on if I were queen for a day.
The pandemic really shows that.
And I was thinking, maybe this is a strange way of thinking about it, but if there's a silver lining from the pandemic, it's that because so many people have been thrust into dire straits, a lot more people are having to confront issues of housing affordability and housing instability.
They were doing that before the pandemic. A lot of them.
What do you mean?
A lot of them were still struggling before the pandemic.
Absolutely. But people who might otherwise have never, clicked on an article by Stephanie or me, right, all of a sudden maybe feel a bit, I don't know if invigorated is the right word, but threatened maybe. How has the pandemic affected some of the work that you do, your research or your day-to-day?
Or the outlook for housing solutions in the city too? I'm curious about that.
I think there is an elevated understanding that, y'all have heard me say this before, that housing is foundational to everything, right? That there's this understanding that if you are lucky enough to be able to work from home, your home really matters, right? Housing stability, when you're dealing with other crises, really matters. Kids being able to go to school from home. It really went from kind of a esoteric idea that we'd talk about to, oh no, it's our daily lives. Like, home really matters. And so I think for the average person, that became very real very quickly. If there's a downside, I think that we were making an enormous amount of progress on some systemic change type work through the House ATL Coalition. And then we had to shift to crisis mode, right? The the big things that we thought we could move forward. And I'm sure you experienced this in your job, right? That you went from saying, okay, we're working on this 24-month, 36-month, type of work to we need to shift to damage control for people in making sure they can stay safely housed. So, I think it's front of mind for people. I think this notion of the K-shaped recovery, and that, plenty of people have done just fine and a lot have not. And that's more, I think, apparent to more people.
Well, it's interesting because it did shine a lot. The pandemic did shine a stronger light on housing issues, I think. But then when I think about the current election and what has been in political ads, it's been public safety and crime typically. Do you think that, Eugene, for example, do you think that the next mayor can really actually keep affordable housing at the front, or at least one of the major issues that they're going to address because of all these concerns about crime in the city that are, valid for the people who have them?
I really don't know. Honestly, I really don't know. I'm not sure. And I won't speak negative about any of the candidates, but I just don't know. I'm not sure their enthusiasm about accomplishing affordable housing, whatever that mechanism is. But I do want to go back. I think, and I've always had a passion for this, affordable means different things to different people. They need to change that name, because I think that's one of the negative words that we put out about affordable housing. We need to change it. I'm not sure what that should be, but it needs to come up to the 21st century. I guess people will grasp what that means and what we're trying to do differently. We just change the nomenclature. And the good examples is CDBG. We've been using CDBG for years.
Community block development grants?
Yeah, community development block grants. And Congress, they don't want to fund it. I say change the name of it because it was a good program, and change the structure of it because we need it, because it helped these nonprofits who providing, community development corporations, all those other types of things that are in the community. Just change. We need a change. That's what I'm saying. Now, not everyone may agree, but I think we need a change. We need to look a different focus, and it just depends on the leadership, how enthusiastic they are, how compassionate they are about it, and see where it goes.
So we're winding down here, but briefly, Sarah, Deirdre, what's at stake on November 30th as far as housing affordability, the future of development in Atlanta goes?
Do you want to go?
You can go.
Well, if you look at the two candidates' plans for affordable housing and crime and public safety, they're actually quite similar. I mean, like very similar. And so a smart mayor could do something like this, say, if we can stably house our citizens, all of our citizens in our city, crime won't be a problem. I mean, there's research out there that there's a lot of empirical research that makes that link. So using language like, I just wrote this down, I got the idea from you. Home really matters to everybody. So if whoever becomes the mayor can cleverly link housing for everybody. So don't use the word affordable, housing for everybody, and say, hey, if we can do that and keep doing stuff about crime, but if we get everybody housed comfortably and stably, we're not going to have this crime problem anymore.
Sarah?
We have like 30 seconds.
I think that's right. I mean, we talk a lot about the power of an address,
Yes.
right? That where you live dictates so much about your future and your success. I do think that who Atlanta is for in some ways is critical in the next 4 years, and what the future looks like, and if people who grew up here can afford to stay here. And I think that is up for grabs. But I do think, to your point, public safety, there's blocking and tackling that has to happen. But if you care about the systemic issues of why we have crime, you have to care about stable housing and that power of the address and what it means for people's prospects.
All right.
Great.
I think that wraps it up for us. Thanks everybody for joining us. I'm Sean Keenan with Atlanta Civic Circle. This is Stephanie Stokes with WABE. And thank you to our panelists, Sarah Kirsch, Gene Jones, Deirdre Oakley. I think that's a wrap.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.